country.
President Donald Trump has announced a trade deal with Japan that he said will result in Japan investing $550 billion into the United States.
Japanese goods will now be facing tariffs of some 15%. That's instead of the 25% tariff.
U.S. President Donald Trump says the U.S. has reached a trade deal with Japan. Trump says the agreement will see Japan invest $550 billion in the country.
When Donald Trump stepped up to the White House podium that sunny afternoon, cameras flashed like lightning. His stride was confident, his expression unmistakable, the look of a man convinced he had just reshaped history. In front of him stood reporters from every major network, pens ready, lenses focused, the air thick with anticipation. Then came the headline moment. The United States has reached a historic trade deal with Japan. Applause erupted. Trump announced that Japan would invest a staggering $550 billion in America's industries. He called it the largest trade deal in U.S. history. Tariffs on Japanese goods, he said, would drop from 25% to 15%. It was, in his words, proof that America's hardline tariff policy was finally paying off, that allies who had long benefited from free trade were now bringing their dollars back to U.S. soil. In that moment, Trump's confidence was electric. Cameras caught him smiling broadly as he shook hands with U.S. business leaders from the energy, shipping, and technology sectors. The message was clear. The era of one-sided trade was over. America was winning again. But behind the cheers and the headlines, a quiet unease was already building, one that would soon explode into a full-blown diplomatic crisis. Because what was announced as a historic victory for Washington would, within weeks, begin to unravel spectacularly. Tokyo's initial silence gave way to defiance. In a nationally televised address, Japan's newly elected prime minister rejected the deal outright, calling it a threat to national interests. Within hours, Japan's Ministry of Finance confirmed it would suspend all payments until Washington relinquished control over how those funds were to be used. The news hit global markets like a thunderclap. The yen plunged, Wall Street shuddered, and for the first time in years, the White House looked caught off guard. What was supposed to be a symbol of American economic dominance suddenly looked like a political miscalculation. By early October, Japan's chief negotiator, Ryo Akasawa, appeared before the press to make Tokyo's position crystal clear. Japan would invest the money on its own terms, independently through its National Development Bank, not under American supervision. To Washington, that sounded like a minor procedural tweak. But in the world of diplomacy, it was an unmistakable act of defiance. Markets reacted instantly. Analysts warned that the so-called Trump-Japan cooperation framework, unveiled with such fanfare just months earlier, might not survive even its first quarter. Rewind to July 2025. Trump had rolled out the deal on the White House lawn, surrounded by cheering executives. Under the published terms, the agreement was meant to slash tariffs on Japanese goods and redirect billions toward key U.S. sectors: shipbuilding, LNG, semiconductor manufacturing, and energy infrastructure. It was billed as a strategic partnership that would reindustrialize America and secure the Indo-Pacific alliance. Bloomberg quoted Trump boasting that the U.S. would receive 90% of the profits. Behind closed doors, though, negotiators admitted the truth. It wasn't a legally binding treaty. It was a political handshake, a deal built on optics and pressure, not durable diplomacy. In Tokyo, discontent brewed quickly. Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba, who had signed the deal under threats of U.S. tariffs, saw his approval rating plummet to below 20%. Critics accused him of selling out Japan's sovereignty for political survival. By September, Ishiba had resigned. Then came a political earthquake in Tokyo. Sanae Takahashi, a conservative nationalist and protege of Shinzo Abe, became Japan's first female prime minister. Her campaign promise was simple but powerful. No deal that compromises Japan's sovereignty will stand. In her first televised address, she declared that any agreement undermining Japan's independence would be re-examined. It was a polite yet unmistakable message to Washington, and it hit like a shockwave. Back in the U.S., Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, one of Trump's closest allies and the architect of the trade framework, told reporters that America expects all partners to honor their commitments. But behind the scenes, even the U.S. Treasury was worried. Reports leaked that Tokyo was planning to maintain tight control over its pledged funds by routing them through domestic institutions rather than transferring them directly to U.S. agencies. Soon after, Reuters confirmed it. Japan was setting up a state-backed investment fund inside the Bank of Japan, a clever move that technically fulfilled the deal but ensured Tokyo kept the reins. The markets read the message instantly. Japan would decide the pace, the scale, and the projects, not Washington. American defense contractors, who had expected huge profits from Japanese-funded projects, saw their shares tumble. The Financial Times described the development as a silent rebellion, and the ripple effect didn't stop there. South Korea, which had signed a similar $350 billion investment framework, began to rethink its own commitments. "We cannot pay in cash," Seoul's security advisor told Reuters flatly. Suddenly, the U.S. wasn't just facing one act of resistance, it was confronting an entire region pushing back. What followed in Washington was part denial, part frustration. Trump, visibly irritated in a televised cabinet meeting, insisted, "We made the best trade deal ever, and yet Japan turned its back on us." His team scrambled to stabilize the situation, launching an accelerated investment program to attract more foreign capital into U.S. industries. But Japan wasn't budging. Tokyo's negotiators emphasized that the investment would not trigger currency shocks, a diplomatic way of saying they'd control the timing and volume of payments. The message to Washington was unmistakable. Japan would not be dictated to. For decades, Japan had been seen as America's most reliable ally in Asia. But under Takahashi's leadership, that loyalty was being redefined. Defying Washington was no longer seen as reckless. It was becoming a badge of honor. Her administration adopted a clear stance. Japan would strengthen its defense partnership with the U.S., remain vigilant against China, but refuse to surrender control over its own economic future. Equality and mutual respect would replace submission and dependence. In Tokyo, that message resonated. Business leaders and economists rallied behind her. Takashi Ninami, CEO of Suntory and one of Japan's most influential corporate figures, told the Financial Times that the U.S. deal lacked transparency and risked destabilizing Japan's economy. He argued that Tokyo couldn't pour hundreds of billions abroad without a clear return or oversight plan. By late September, doubts began to grow around the deal's flagship project, the $44 billion LNG export terminal in Alaska. Construction costs had soared, demand forecasts were falling, and Japanese utilities were quietly reconsidering. Some insiders admitted Tokyo's real goal was now to delay and eventually withdraw. For Trump's administration, the optics were disastrous. A deal once hailed as a triumph of American leverage was now being portrayed as evidence of overreach. Commerce Secretary Lutnick warned of serious consequences if Japan delayed. The threat of renewed tariffs loomed large, though many observers saw it as political theater. Meanwhile, U.S. corporations that had backed Trump's industrial vision began voicing unease. "We came to invest," one executive told the Financial Times, "not to fight a new Cold War with our biggest customer." The grand narrative of victory was dissolving into a story of tension, miscalculation, and shifting power. The $550 billion trade deal, once celebrated as proof of America's unmatched influence, had become a mirror reflecting a changing world, one where allies like Japan are no longer silent followers.